I want you to be brutally honest with me for a second. What do you actually do for a living? I'm not asking for your official job title, and I don't care about your daily list of tasks. I want to know what you actually create, what you improve, and what tangible value you contribute to society. If you just hesitated, you might be trapped in a bullshit job. For some of you watching this, that question might be pretty easy to answer. If you are a nurse, a construction worker, or a plumber, your contribution is undeniably real. But for those of you who find yourselves working as a middle manager, overseeing a human resources team at an insurance underwriting company, well, it might be a little harder to justify your professional existence. Over the last century, service jobs have absolutely exploded. They have gone from representing less than a quarter of all jobs to now representing nearly 80% of all workers. Now, when we traditionally think of service jobs, we picture people directly serving us. The barista making our morning coffee, the retail worker finding a pair of pants from out the back, or the bellhop carrying heavy bags to our hotel room. Sure, these conveniences might be considered unnecessary luxuries for the people using these services, but it's still incredibly easy to see that they do produce value. You get a nice cup of coffee, a flashy new outfit, or promptly delivered luggage without the need for a physical therapy appointment the very next day. But here is the dark secret of the modern economy. The service sector is far more broad than the name actually implies. It encompasses absolutely everybody, from low-level call center salespeople all the way up to Fortune 500 CEOs. In fact, it is quite difficult these days to find a lucrative job outside of the service sector, specifically because those manual or direct value roles often require special physical certifications. Remember that detail for later, because it is incredibly important. The massive growth of this self-serving service sector and the subsequent rise in bullshit jobs that came with it seems a bit odd on the surface. We are taught that the efficient free market is a ruthless optimizer. Surely the invisible hand of the market would weed out these individuals that are contributing absolutely nothing. Surely it would punish the companies that bear their bloated salary expenses while actively rewarding the more efficient, lean organizations that do without them, right? Well, no. And to understand exactly why, it's time to learn how money works in the modern day to perpetuate the existence of millions of people who work to do nothing but justify their own existence. To kick things off, to understand this bizarre quirk of modern advanced capitalism, we actually need to first look at its mortal enemy, Soviet communism. The Soviet Union was built entirely on the ideological pillar of noble labor. The state dictated that work was inherently honorable and dignified. The very word Soviet loosely translates to a workers' council, and the citizens took immense systemic pride in their labor above all else. But this utopian ideal caused massive logistical problems when there simply wasn't enough actual work to go around amongst everybody. The state's relentless drive for 100% full employment meant that some people were handed tasks that were obviously totally redundant. Factory managers aggressively hired as many people as they possibly could because it was considered deeply honorable to oversee the labor of so many of your comrades. They also lived in constant strategic fear that if they didn't give people jobs right now, they wouldn't be able to get the personnel they actually did need in the future when production quotas changed. This bizarre phenomenon became known as worker hoarding. It meant that fully capable adults were given mind-numbing jobs, like counting endless, dusty inventories of nuts and bolts just to keep them busy. Now, obviously, there are huge, undeniable differences between the modern Western corporate world and 1950s Russia, but there are also some deeply concerning similarities that we are completely ignoring. The underlying theory of totally unnecessary employment really started to gain global traction after the anthropologist David Graeber published the book Bullshit Jobs. In it, he perfectly outlined 5 broad categories of jobs that had become more and more common, like a virus in our economy. First, we have what he called the flunkies. Think of people like doormen, receptionists, chauffeurs, and excessive administrative assistants. These people exist for one primary reason: to make other people feel better about themselves. They are status symbols in human form, and they could all easily be replaced with some kind of basic technology. That's if they are really needed at all. Then there are the duct tapers. These are exhausted employees who work tirelessly to alleviate problems that could very easily be fixed permanently if the company just cared enough to do so. Think of someone like an inventory manager that just so happens to have the exclusive system permissions to update stock levels in a warehouse, where that entire process could be done automatically, or at the very least shared amongst the floor staff who actually handle the goods. In his book, Graeber talks of a classic duct taper whose entire full-time job was fixing the glaring mistakes made by an apparently brilliant statistician. In reality, this star employee was actually utterly hopeless, and the duct taper had to spend 40 hours a week fighting with internal bureaucracy to get his mistakes fixed before they could do any catastrophic financial damage to the firm. This specific example perfectly shows that the solution to the problem is not always just getting rid of the person in the bullshit job. The duct taper themselves was probably a highly capable person, contributing some value, but they would be able to create value much more effectively had a needless structural obstacle been removed. The exact same cannot be said for the next category on the bullshit jobs list, and that is the box tickers. This is the vast army of mindless corporate drones that exist in big companies around the world, simply because they make said companies appear legitimate to other big companies. Think of the people tasked with creating internal company newspapers filled with painfully boring stories about key executives, or whatever it is that's reported in those things. Let's be honest, nobody actually reads them. And frankly, that's the entire point. But if a billion-dollar company didn't have a flashy internal newspaper, or a dedicated party planning committee, or a chief culture coordinator, then it might look like a small fry company not worth doing business with or working for. Now it's time to descend into the real demons of the bullshit job world. The goons. Goons is the affectionate name given to a class of job that actually has a net negative impact on society, but they make themselves strictly necessary by simply existing. The absolute classic example of this is in-house corporate lawyers. They don't really produce anything of tangible value, but if your company doesn't have them, it will end up costing you a massive fortune to hire external counsel to fight off aggressive lawsuits from rival companies that do have internal corporate lawyers. It is the ultimate corporate arms race. Perhaps the best example of this toxic system are patent trolls. These are basically shell companies that will buy up other struggling companies with lots of generic patents. They then try to sue other active companies in the predatory hope that the victim will just agree to settle out of court rather than fighting a multi-year legal battle. Even the largest, most respected companies in the world are deeply guilty of perpetuating this negative-sum game. Apple famously sued Samsung for a patent over, get this, a rectangular phone with rounded corners. Now, just ask yourself, despite whatever personal opinions you might hold about patents and the necessity of intellectual property, what actual human value was being created by the thousands of people whose full-time job it was to fiercely enforce that petty ruling? Beyond just the lawyers, the Goon Squad includes people like corporate lobbyists who fight tirelessly to simply change the rules of the economic game around in their favor, and corporate salespeople who exist purely to move business dealings from one company to another while being the textbook definition of a middleman in the process. Now, you might think the goons are bad, but they have absolutely nothing on the worst of the worst amongst this bunch of pointless workers, the taskmasters. These are the people whose sole assignment is to watch over and manage people that really truly don't need to be watched over or managed. Look, effective management absolutely does exist, especially when it is actively coordinating a complex team with a wide set of diverse skills. But someone like a regional sales manager who aggressively lords over a team of people with exactly the same job title is a little bit different. At best, they are going to be an overpaid cheerleader, forcefully encouraging people to work harder in roles that may themselves be entirely bullshit. At worst, they will be active liabilities and massive distractions. Desperate to justify their own high salaries and existence, they will start calling pointless meetings and creating strategic mission statements that achieve absolutely nothing, but pulling actual producers away from a job where they do actually have a slim chance of doing something meaningful. Keep in mind, these roles are not singular, isolated prescriptions. In fact, some particularly useless corporate employees may find that their role is a horrific combination of all 5 of these factors. Many middle managers exist solely to oversee fundamentally useless, redundant departments, and they only have a job because a highly layered, overly complex corporate hierarchy makes the bigwigs at the very top of the food chain feel good about themselves. But this brings us to the ultimate question. How on earth did we get here? We know the Soviet Union created bullshit jobs because it was ideologically obsessed with having a job for everybody, and the nation took deep pride in labor. But our hyper-efficient capitalist systems are supposed to be vastly better than that, right? Well, sort of. But the terrifying truth is we are still victims of the exact same breed of bureaucracy. Sure, in a theoretical vacuum, companies would do incredibly well for their bottom line by ruthlessly cutting down on these useless tasks. But in reality, these financial incentives can be wildly misaligned with the people who are actually making the decisions. In the exact same way a Soviet factory worker might hoard staff to build a fiefdom and make themselves seem vital to the state, modern corporate middle managers will do the exact same thing to protect their budgets and their prestige. In the same way brutalist factory walls were plastered in state-sponsored propaganda about the unmatched brilliance of Soviet laborers, modern LinkedIn pages are absolutely covered in self-serving, narcissistic propaganda. You read endless posts about how much of an incredible honor it was for some junior synergy analyst to spearhead the joint development project for streamlining customer satisfaction in the bullshit corporation multi-platform digital sales ecosystem. It's the same psychological mechanism, just with a modern corporate filter. In the same way that the Soviet Union was completely obsessed with everybody having some sort of work to do, even if it meant making up meaningless jobs, modern corporate workplaces are pathologically obsessed with everybody working their full, grueling 40-hour weeks, even if it means, well, making up completely meaningless tasks just to keep them glued to their swivel chairs until 5 p.m. And all of this is before we even consider the crushing weight of modern bureaucracy. Let's get one massive misconception out of the way right now. Countries like the USA are absolutely not home to totally free, unregulated markets. There are incredibly dense laws and regulations dictating exactly how to do pretty much everything. Do you want to build a new factory? Well, you better make absolutely sure it's in a specific location zoned for heavy industry. You better conduct an extensive, appropriate tender for the contract to construct that factory and have the incredibly expensive, appropriate insurance. And if you are shipping your finished products overseas, you need to make sure you pay the exact appropriate tariffs and excises. Every single one of these mandatory steps involves interacting with other massive, bloated institutions, which will themselves harbor thousands of their very own bullshit jobs. Now, I want to be clear. This isn't a black and white argument for a narco-capitalist small government or socialist big government. Some of these policies and regulations really are critically important for public safety, and of course, some of them are pure, unadulterated bullshit. But massive corporate conglomerates have played a very important, highly calculated part in building this whole convoluted system as well. The exponential growth in corporate lobbying has directly led to the creation of more and more complex legislation. This legal labyrinth has made it such that starting and maintaining a successful competing business of any real size is almost entirely impossible without hiring a massive team of expensive accountants and lawyers who will help a business owner navigate this bureaucracy. You might logically point out that this is entirely in the best interest of large established corporations, simply because it acts as a massive moat. It makes it incredibly hard for lean potential startup competitors to get off the ground. But hey, we don't want to point fingers here, do we? Anyway, after all this doom and gloom, is there an actual solution to this epidemic? As a broad society, sure. We could start by universally embracing the radical idea that it's actually perfectly okay to not work 40 hours a week if the work is already done. The idea that a job is completely binary, either 100% bullshit or 100% vital, is not entirely correct. In reality, almost all modern jobs will have some level of bullshit inherently built into their daily duties. If it was socially and professionally acceptable to stand up at 2 p.m. and say, "My actual work is done, I'm clocking out for the day," then it would become glaringly obvious who is actually contributing value and who is contributing nothing. But what about for you as an individual navigating this mess? Not really. The brutal truth is, if you do find yourself trapped in a lucrative role filled with a lot of bullshit tasks, you might just have to suck it up in the short term. Your best bet might be to take the paycheck, do the bare minimum, and maybe work on a meaningful side hustle that is completely free from corporate bullshit in your off time. Or, you could just fully embrace the madness. There are lots of people out there who are genuinely very proud of their superfluous, yet incredibly important sounding job titles. Maybe it makes enduring the pointless Monday morning syncs or the completely irrelevant 60-slide PowerPoints a little bit easier to get through now that you finally know the truth. It's all bullshit. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to escape the corporate matrix, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel to keep on learning how money truly works.